In the narrow streets of Boston's North End in the winter of 1896, where Irish and Italian immigrants crowded into tenement buildings that blocked the sun and trapped the cold, where children played in alleys that smelled of coal smoke and rotting garbage, where disease moved through cramped quarters like a ghost selecting victims, there lived a family named Winslow in a third-floor apartment on Hanover Street that consisted of 3 rooms for 6 people. A father who worked 14-hour shifts at a textile mill, a mother who took in laundry to supplement their income, and 4 children ranging in age from 18 months to 9 years. The Winslows were unremarkable among thousands of working-class families struggling to survive in an American city at the height of the industrial age, distinguished from their neighbors only by the fact that their second oldest child, a daughter named Charlotte, 7 years old in the winter of 1896, possessed something that no one could explain: an ability to understand human anatomy and perform medical procedures with a precision that trained surgeons found both miraculous and deeply disturbing. Charlotte Winslow was born on March 3, 1889, delivered at home by a midwife in a difficult birth that nearly killed both mother and child. For her first few years, she appeared to be a normal child, perhaps slightly quieter than average, prone to staring at things for long periods, as if studying them with unusual intensity, but nothing that suggested any extraordinary abilities. She learned to walk and talk at normal ages, played with her siblings, helped her mother with small household tasks, attended a parish school where she proved adequate but not exceptional at reading and arithmetic. She was, by all accounts, an ordinary working-class child in an era when childhood was brief, and no one had time to worry about whether children showed special gifts or unusual interests. The event that revealed Charlotte's abilities occurred on January 14, 1896, when her younger brother Samuel, age 4, suffered a compound fracture of his left arm after falling from a second-story window onto the cobblestones below. Samuel had been playing on the fire escape against his parents' strict instructions when the rusted railing gave way. He fell approximately 12 feet, landing badly, his left arm bent at an angle that made witnesses sick to see. Bone protruded through the skin just below the elbow, blood pooling on the frozen ground, the child screaming in a way that brought every resident of the building running. Charlotte's mother, Eleanor, gathered Samuel in her arms while someone ran to fetch Dr. William Hartley, the local physician who maintained a practice serving the North End's poor for fees they could rarely afford to pay. Dr. Hartley was known as a competent, if not exceptional, practitioner, a man who had learned his trade in the Civil War treating wounded soldiers under battlefield conditions, who had seen enough trauma that little shocked him anymore. He arrived at the Winslow apartment within 20 minutes of being summoned, examined Samuel's arm, and delivered news that Eleanor had been dreading. The break was severe. The bone had shattered in multiple places. Infection was likely given the exposure of tissue to dirty street conditions, and even if the arm could be saved, which was questionable, the boy would likely never have full use of it again. The best option, Dr. Hartley suggested with the bluntness common to doctors of that era, might be amputation, removing the damaged limb before infection could spread and threaten Samuel's life. Eleanor Winslow, faced with a choice between her son's arm and his life, asked for time to discuss the decision with her husband when he returned from his shift at the mill. Dr. Hartley agreed to return the following morning, leaving instructions for keeping Samuel comfortable with laudanum and monitoring for signs of fever that would indicate infection had begun. He set the bone as well as he could, wrapped the arm in bandages, and departed with little hope that Samuel would keep the limb. What happened during the night of January 14th and early morning of January 15th, 1896, is documented in multiple testimonies that were later collected by investigators from Massachusetts General Hospital. According to Eleanor Winslow's account, she sat beside Samuel's bed through the night, watching him drift in and out of morphine-induced sleep, occasionally waking to cry out in pain that the laudanum couldn't completely suppress. Charlotte, who shared a bedroom with her 3 siblings, woke around 2 o'clock in the morning and came to stand beside her mother. Eleanor told her to go back to bed, but Charlotte ignored the instruction, instead leaning close to examine Samuel's bandaged arm, with an expression that Eleanor later described as intensely focused, as if she could see through the wrappings to the damaged tissue beneath. After several minutes of this examination, Charlotte spoke for the first time, telling her mother that Dr. Hartley had set the bone incorrectly, that the fragments weren't aligned properly, that if left this way, the arm would heal wrong, and Samuel would indeed lose the use of it. Eleanor, exhausted and distraught, initially dismissed this as a child's confusion, but Charlotte insisted with a certainty that seemed strange coming from a 7-year-old that she knew what was wrong and knew how to fix it. She explained, using terminology that Eleanor didn't understand, but would later recognize as correct medical vocabulary, that the radial bone had splintered in 3 places, that fragments were pressing against the ulnar artery creating risk of thrombosis, that the muscle tissue had been damaged in ways that would prevent proper healing unless addressed immediately. Charlotte told her mother that she needed to re-break the bone, remove the fragments, repair the arterial damage, and realign everything correctly before infection set in. She spoke calmly, matter-of-factly, as if describing how to prepare a meal rather than proposing to perform surgery on her brother. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and if this is your first time on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that official history preferred to forget. Eleanor Winslow, by her own later admission, was too exhausted and desperate to think clearly about how absurd Charlotte's proposal was. She had been awake for 36 hours. Her 4-year-old son was lying in agony with an injury that a trained doctor had said would likely cost him his arm. And her 7-year-old daughter was calmly explaining surgical procedures with vocabulary that no child should possess. In a state that was probably more numb acceptance than rational decision-making, Eleanor found herself gathering the materials Charlotte requested. The sharpest knife in the kitchen, boiled and cooled water, clean cloth torn into strips, needle and thread from the sewing kit, more laudanum to keep Samuel unconscious during whatever Charlotte was planning to do. Charlotte washed her hands thoroughly, scrubbing them with soap and water as hot as she could stand, explaining to her mother that cleanliness was critical to prevent corruption of the wound. This was 1896, when germ theory was still relatively new and controversial, when many doctors still didn't accept the importance of antiseptic technique. Yet a 7-year-old girl was calmly insisting on sterilization protocols that wouldn't become standard medical practice for another decade. Charlotte unwrapped Samuel's arm, examined the wound by lamplight, and began to work. Eleanor watched, too shocked to intervene, as her daughter made precise incisions to extend the wound opening, providing better access to the damaged tissue beneath. Charlotte worked with steady hands, showing no hesitation or uncertainty, removing bone fragments piece by piece, cleaning the wound thoroughly, locating the damaged artery that Eleanor couldn't see but Charlotte apparently could, and repairing it with stitches so fine and precise that Eleanor compared them to lace-making. The entire procedure took approximately 45 minutes, during which Charlotte maintained complete focus, occasionally explaining what she was doing in medical terminology that Eleanor didn't understand, but would later have confirmed as accurate by trained physicians. Charlotte realigned the bone fragments, positioning them with care that seemed impossible for a child's hands, secured them with splints fashioned from strips of wood, and finally closed the wound with sutures that Dr. Hartley would later describe as superior to his own technique. When finished, Charlotte washed her hands again, wrapped the arm in clean bandages, and told her mother that Samuel would be fine, that the bone would heal properly, that in 6 weeks he would have full use of the arm again. Then she went back to bed as if nothing unusual had occurred, as if performing complex surgery on her brother in the middle of the night was a normal thing for a 2nd grader to do. Eleanor sat in stunned silence beside Samuel's bed, waiting for signs that her daughter's interventions had made things worse, expecting fever or renewed bleeding or some indication that allowing a child to cut into her son had been a terrible mistake. Instead, Samuel slept peacefully for the first time since his injury, his breathing steady, his color improving as the night progressed. When Dr. Hartley arrived the following morning to discuss amputation, he found Samuel resting comfortably with no signs of fever or infection. He examined the arm, intending to prepare it for surgery, and discovered that someone had already operated. The bandages were fresh, the sutures were professional quality, the wound showed signs of proper cleaning and treatment. Dr. Hartley demanded to know what surgeon Eleanor had called without his knowledge, insisting that no one in the North End had the skills to have performed the work he was seeing. Eleanor, with obvious reluctance, explained that Charlotte had done it, that her 7-year-old daughter had operated on Samuel during the night. Dr. Hartley's initial reaction was disbelief mixed with anger, convinced that Eleanor was lying to him for some reason he couldn't fathom. But Eleanor insisted on her story, and when Dr. Hartley examined Charlotte, questioning her about what she had done, the child calmly and precisely described the entire surgical procedure, explaining her reasoning for each step, using medical terminology that a 7-year-old daughter of factory workers simply couldn't know. She described the anatomy of the arm in detail that medical students took years to learn, identified problems with Dr. Hartley's original treatment that he had to admit were valid, and showed a comprehension of human physiology that seemed impossible for any child, let alone one who had never received any formal education beyond basic reading and arithmetic. Dr. Hartley, confronted with evidence he couldn't deny, made a decision that would change his life and Charlotte's. He reported the case to his colleagues at Massachusetts General Hospital, describing a child who had performed surgery beyond his own capabilities, urging them to examine this extraordinary patient who had somehow acquired medical knowledge without any training or education. The response from the medical establishment was initially skeptical, assuming that Dr. Hartley had been fooled by some hoax or had misunderstood what had actually occurred. But as Samuel's arm healed over the following weeks, healing better and faster than any compound fracture Dr. Hartley had ever treated, skepticism began to give way to curiosity. In February of 1896, Charlotte Winslow was brought to Massachusetts General Hospital for examination by a committee of senior physicians. She arrived with her mother, a small girl in a worn dress and scuffed shoes, looking like thousands of other working-class children in Boston, except for her eyes, which multiple doctors commented on in their reports, describing them as unnervingly focused, as if she were studying everything around her with an intensity that seemed wrong in a child. The examination began with simple questions about what Charlotte had done to treat her brother, questions that expanded into detailed discussions of anatomy, physiology, pathology, and surgical technique. Charlotte answered everything with calm precision, drawing diagrams when asked to illustrate her explanations, using correct medical terminology, demonstrating knowledge that seemed comprehensive and sophisticated rather than limited to the specific case of her brother's injury. When asked where she had learned these things, Charlotte's answer was consistent and troubling. She didn't know. She didn't know. She had always known them. Or at least, she had known them when she needed to know them. She couldn't explain how she knew the names of bones, or the location of arteries, or the proper technique for suturing damaged tissue. When she looked at her brother's injury, she had simply understood what was wrong and what needed to be done to fix it, the knowledge appearing in her mind complete and ready to apply, as if downloaded from some source she couldn't identify or explain. The doctors decided to test Charlotte's abilities under controlled conditions. They presented her with medical texts, asking her to read and explain concepts that physicians studied for years to master. Charlotte, who attended a parish school where reading instruction barely extended beyond simple sentences, read complex medical Latin with perfect pronunciation and comprehension, explaining concepts of pathology and pharmacology that she should never have encountered. They showed her anatomical drawings and asked her to identify structures. She named every bone, muscle, organ, and vessel without hesitation, adding details about function and common pathologies that went beyond what the drawings showed. They described hypothetical medical cases and asked how she would treat them. Her responses demonstrated not just knowledge, but judgment, the ability to weigh different treatment options and select the most appropriate based on complex factors that even experienced physicians sometimes struggled to evaluate correctly. Dr. Richard Morrison, chief of surgery at Massachusetts General, was particularly interested in Charlotte's abilities. He arranged for her to observe an actual surgery, a leg amputation being performed on a patient with gangrene, assuming that a 7-year-old would be frightened or sickened by the reality of cutting into human flesh. Charlotte watched the entire procedure with calm attention, and when it was finished, politely explained to Dr. Morrison that the surgeon had made several errors that would complicate the patient's recovery, identifying specific mistakes in tissue handling and vascular management that Morrison had to admit were valid criticisms. Morrison then invited Charlotte to assist with a minor procedure the following day, the removal of a benign tumor from a patient's shoulder. With Charlotte's parents' nervous permission and the patient's bemused consent, a 7-year-old girl was allowed to participate in surgery at one of America's most prestigious hospitals. Witnesses to this operation, including 5 senior physicians, testified later that Charlotte handled surgical instruments with confidence and precision, that her technique was superior to many trained surgeons, that she demonstrated spatial awareness and manual dexterity that seemed impossible for someone her age and size. Most disturbingly, she appeared to understand the patient's anatomy better than the operating surgeon, twice suggesting modifications to the planned procedure that Morrison reluctantly accepted and which proved correct and beneficial. Over the following months, Charlotte participated in numerous medical evaluations and demonstrations. She was tested by psychologists, examined by neurologists, studied by researchers from Harvard Medical School who were attempting to understand how a child could possess knowledge that should have required decades of education and experience to acquire. Every test confirmed the same impossible reality. Charlotte Winslow, 7 years old, barely literate, daughter of factory workers, possessed comprehensive medical knowledge equivalent to or exceeding that of trained physicians with years of practice. Various theories were proposed to explain Charlotte's abilities. Some doctors suggested she must have been secretly studying medical texts, perhaps sneaking into a library or hospital when no one was watching. But this couldn't explain how she had learned to read medical Latin, or how she had acquired practical surgical skills that couldn't be gained from books alone. Others proposed that she might have been trained by some renegade physician who had taught her in secret, but no such person could be identified. And Charlotte's parents insisted she had never been away from their supervision long enough for such training to occur. A few researchers suggested that Charlotte might have accessed medical knowledge through some form of inherited memory, that perhaps somewhere in her ancestry there had been physicians whose knowledge was somehow encoded and transmitted. But this was recognized as pure speculation without any scientific basis. The most disturbing theory, proposed by Dr. Eugene Blackwell, a psychologist from Boston University, was that Charlotte might be accessing knowledge from some external source that couldn't be identified, that her consciousness might be capable of connecting to information beyond the boundaries of her personal experience and education. Dr. Blackwell conducted extensive interviews with Charlotte, trying to understand her subjective experience of knowing medical information. Charlotte described it as similar to remembering something she had learned long ago. Information that was simply there when she needed it, emerging into her awareness fully formed and immediately applicable. She didn't experience learning or discovery, but rather recognition, as if the knowledge had always been part of her and she was only just becoming aware of it. When asked if she could access other types of knowledge beyond medical information, Charlotte said she didn't know, that she had never tried, that it had only been necessary to know about medicine when Samuel was hurt and needed help. Dr. Blackwell attempted to test whether Charlotte could demonstrate similar abilities in other fields, presenting her with texts on law, engineering, classical languages, advanced mathematics. Charlotte showed no special aptitude in any of these areas beyond what might be expected from a reasonably intelligent 7-year-old. Whatever allowed her to access medical knowledge appeared to be specific rather than general, confined to human anatomy, physiology, pathology, and treatment. This specificity made the mystery even more profound. If Charlotte was somehow accessing inherited knowledge or racial memory or some collective unconscious, why would it be limited to medical information? If she had secretly studied or been trained, why would that training have been confined to medicine? The evidence suggested that Charlotte's abilities were both extraordinary and narrowly focused, as if some part of her consciousness had access to a complete library of medical knowledge that appeared only when needed and couldn't be extended to other domains. Charlotte's life changed dramatically after her abilities became public. The Winslow family was offered money by various medical institutions and private individuals interested in studying Charlotte or employing her abilities. Her parents, overwhelmed by attention and uncertain about what was best for their daughter, initially refused most offers, trying to maintain some sense of normal life for Charlotte and her siblings. But pressure from the medical community was intense, with doctors arguing that Charlotte's abilities represented an unprecedented opportunity to advance medical knowledge, and that keeping her from practicing medicine would be a waste of her gifts and a disservice to patients who could benefit from her skills. In June of 1896, a private foundation was established specifically to support Charlotte's education and medical practice. The arrangement allowed the Winslow family to move from their tenement apartment to a proper house in a better neighborhood, provided for Charlotte's siblings' education, and gave her parents enough financial security that they could stop working in the mills and focus on their family. In exchange, Charlotte was to continue demonstrating her abilities to medical researchers and to assist with surgical cases that were particularly complex or difficult. She was, effectively, employed as a surgical consultant at age 7, attending operations where trained physicians would defer to her judgment on questions of technique and treatment. The ethical implications of using a child this way were debated but ultimately dismissed. The argument being that Charlotte's abilities were so extraordinary that normal rules about childhood and education didn't apply. For the next 3 years, Charlotte Winslow occupied a strange space in Boston's medical community. Simultaneously a child who should have been playing with dolls and a surgical genius whose skills exceeded those of doctors who had practiced for decades. She attended regular school to maintain some semblance of normal childhood, but was pulled out regularly to participate in medical procedures or consultations. She had no friends her own age. Children found her disturbing, and adults treated her as either a curiosity or a valuable resource, rather than as a child. Her parents struggled with the situation, grateful for the financial security but increasingly concerned about what Charlotte's strange abilities were doing to her development and well-being. Dr. Morrison, who had become something of a mentor to Charlotte, noted in his private journals that the child seemed to be aging in ways that had nothing to do with years, that her eyes grew older each month, that she seemed to be carrying a weight that no 7, 8, 9-year-old should have to bear. She was unfailingly polite and professional during medical procedures, showing no squeamishness or distress even during the most traumatic surgeries. But she also showed no joy, no childlike enthusiasm or wonder, as if accessing knowledge that shouldn't be available to her had cost her something essential about childhood. In November of 1899, Charlotte participated in what would be her final surgical case. A man had been brought to Massachusetts General Hospital with a complex abdominal injury sustained in an industrial accident. The attending surgeons were uncertain about the extent of internal damage or the best approach to treatment. Charlotte, now 10 years old, was called in to consult. She examined the patient, listened to descriptions of his symptoms, and began explaining what surgical procedure would be required. But midway through her explanation, she stopped speaking, her face going blank, her eyes losing focus. Dr. Morrison asked if she was all right. Charlotte didn't respond, standing motionless for several minutes while doctors watched with growing concern. When she finally spoke again, her words were strange and troubling. She said that it was leaving, that the knowledge was going away, that she could feel it draining out of her mind like water through a sieve. She described anatomical structures and procedures that were becoming unclear, concepts that moments ago had been completely comprehensible, now seeming foreign and confusing. She tried to continue her explanation of the surgical case, but couldn't remember what she'd been saying, couldn't recall the medical terminology she'd been using moments before. Within less than an hour, Charlotte Winslow had transformed from a medical prodigy to a confused child who couldn't explain what had happened to her, or where the knowledge she'd possessed had gone. Extensive testing over the following weeks confirmed what seemed impossible, but was undeniable. Charlotte had lost her medical knowledge completely. She couldn't identify anatomical structures she'd been able to name perfectly just days before. couldn't read medical texts she'd previously comprehended without difficulty, couldn't explain even basic concepts of human physiology that had been trivially simple for her. It was as if the knowledge had been deleted from her mind, leaving no trace that it had ever been there except the testimony of hundreds of witnesses who had seen her demonstrate abilities that now were completely gone. Charlotte herself couldn't explain what had happened. She remembered participating in surgeries and medical consultations, remembered being able to do things that seemed impossible now. But she had no access to the knowledge she'd once possessed, no ability to recall even fragments of information that had been completely available to her for 3 years. She was, once again, just a 10-year-old girl, not exceptionally bright, not particularly interested in medicine, showing no special abilities of any kind. The medical community that had celebrated Charlotte as a miracle now struggled to understand what she had been. The foundation that had supported her was dissolved. The financial support withdrawn on the basis that Charlotte no longer possessed the extraordinary abilities that had justified the arrangement. The Winslow family, having become dependent on that support, found themselves in difficult financial circumstances, unable to return to their previous life, but no longer qualifying for special assistance. They moved back to a working-class neighborhood, and Charlotte resumed a normal education at a regular school, where she proved to be an average student with no particular gifts. She remembered very little of her 3 years as a medical prodigy, describing that period of her life as feeling like a dream or like memories that belonged to someone else. Dr. Morrison maintained contact with Charlotte's family for several years, partly out of genuine concern for the girl, and partly because he hoped that her abilities might return as mysteriously as they had appeared and disappeared. But Charlotte never demonstrated any unusual medical knowledge again, growing into an ordinary adolescent, then an ordinary young woman. Showing no trace of the prodigious abilities that had made her famous in medical circles when she was 7 years old. She married at 19, had 4 children, lived a quiet life in Boston suburbs, and died in 1954 at the age of 65, having spent 55 years as a completely ordinary person and only 3 years as something extraordinary and inexplicable. The medical documentation of Charlotte Winslow's case remains in the archives of Massachusetts General Hospital, including detailed records of the procedures she participated in, transcripts of her explanations of medical concepts, and testimonies from dozens of physicians who witnessed her abilities. Dr. Morrison, who continued practicing surgery until his death in 1932, wrote extensively about Charlotte's case, proposing various theories about how a child might temporarily access knowledge beyond anything her education and experience could account for. His conclusion, published in the Boston Medical Journal in 1920, was that Charlotte represented a phenomenon that medical science wasn't equipped to understand, that her abilities suggested possibilities about human consciousness and knowledge acquisition that challenged fundamental assumptions about how minds work and where knowledge comes from. Some researchers have suggested that Charlotte might have been a case of savant syndrome, where individuals show extraordinary abilities in narrow domains despite otherwise normal or below normal intelligence. But savant abilities typically persist throughout a person's life rather than appearing suddenly and disappearing completely within a few years. Others have proposed that Charlotte might have experienced a rare form of temporal lobe epilepsy that somehow gave her access to medical knowledge, though no known neurological condition can explain the comprehensive and practical nature of her abilities or their sudden disappearance. A few investigators have suggested the case might have been an elaborate hoax, that the child who performed surgeries wasn't actually Charlotte Winslow, but a trained adult who resembled her, or that the medical procedures weren't as complex as reported. But the documentation is too extensive and comes from too many independent witnesses for these explanations to be credible. The most unsettling possibility is the one Dr. Blackwell proposed in his 1897 paper on Charlotte's case, that human consciousness might be capable of accessing knowledge from sources beyond individual experience, that under certain circumstances, perhaps in response to critical need, a mind might connect to information that exists somewhere outside normal channels of learning and memory. If this is true, It raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness, about where knowledge resides, about the boundaries between individual minds and whatever larger system of information might exist beyond personal awareness. If this story revealed something you never knew about the mysteries of human knowledge and the capabilities of consciousness, leave a comment telling us what surprised you most. And if you want more untold stories of people who demonstrated abilities that science couldn't explain, subscribe. These stories matter, not just as history, but as reminders that human consciousness remains deeply mysterious, that the boundaries of what minds can do are less certain than we assume. That children, especially, might be capable of accessing knowledge in ways that adults cannot or have forgotten how to do. Charlotte Winslow, for 3 years in the late 1890s, demonstrated abilities that dozens of respected physicians witnessed and documented but could never explain, and then lost those abilities as mysteriously as she'd gained them, leaving behind only medical records and the unsettling question of what a 7-year-old girl's mind connected to when she looked at her brother's shattered arm and somehow knew exactly how to fix it. Knew things she'd never been taught and couldn't explain knowing. Knew with certainty and precision that saved a life and then vanished, taking with it any hope of understanding where that knowledge came from or why it appeared when it did. In a child who should have known nothing about surgery but somehow knew everything, until suddenly she didn't, and she was just a girl again, ordinary and unremarkable, living the rest of her life without any trace of the prodigy she'd briefly been, leaving doctors to wonder what they'd really witnessed and whether the human mind holds capabilities we've forgotten or never understood, waiting perhaps for moments of critical need to emerge from wherever they hide, to save lives and demonstrate possibilities that vanish before we can study them properly, leaving only records and memories and questions that nearly a century later remain as unanswerable as they were the night a 7-year-old girl performed surgery by lamplight and saved her brother's arm with knowledge that came from nowhere, and knowledge that came from nowhere eventually returned there, leaving science baffled and Charlotte Winslow herself unable to explain what she'd been or how she'd done what every witness agreed she'd done. Impossibly, inexplicably, and then never again.